my talk's going to be more specific about the particular case of the Holy Land Foundation, and particularly the 5 men that were involved and ended up in federal prison. And there are a couple of interesting insights that I gained as a result of working on this topic and then writing the book. The first one is that there's this expectation, or there's this assumption in America that there is such a thing as civil liberties, and that they are available, and there's something we all expect to have. And the second thing is that America does not have political persecution. There's no political persecution in America, and there are no political prisoners in America. So the insight that I got was that these are all assumptions that are made by white privileged America. Because, like we heard earlier, other communities, the black communities, Latinos, and others, have never had these liberties and have never had an expectation of having these liberties because they don't exist for them. So this was an interesting insight that I gained as a result of this. I heard about this case about 5 years ago. I gave a talk in Dallas, and after the talk, some of the activists who invited me to give the talk came up and told me about this case. And my first reaction was, well, this is impossible. This couldn't be true. I mean, it can't be that such an enormous injustice has taken place in America, where we know the justice system is, clean and not corrupt and fair and so forth, which is another one of those assumptions that I and many others make, and I learned was not true. So as I looked more and more into the case, I realized there was a story here that should be told, and particularly a story that should be told by someone who looks like me, so at the top of the privileged food chain, if you will. A guy, white, privileged, Jewish, and so forth, Israeli. And so I decided to write this book. In the course of working on this book, which was really a lot of work, and took me about 5 years, I was able to, I needed to visit 5 men in prison, in federal prison, read thousands and thousands of pages of court documents, and I tried to put as many of those court documents and transcripts in the manuscript, and really just shake my head in disbelief at the way in which a trial takes place in a court in America. It's beyond belief. As I was reading through the court documents, like I said, I tried to put as many of them as possible. I read about 20,000 pages of court transcripts, just because you have to read it to believe it. You have to read the goings-on in the courtroom to believe that it could be such an absurd reality, and what judges allow to happen in a courtroom. So who are the Holy Land Foundation? What was the Holy Land Foundation? Like we heard earlier, the Holy Land Foundation was the largest, at one time, the largest Muslim charity in America. And they were doing tremendous work. They were involved in doing tremendous work around the world. They were incredibly successful in creating alliances and in getting the job to which they were committed done, and done well, and done cheaply. And this created a problem. And why did this create a problem? Like Lena was saying earlier, their success was the reason they had to be brought down. Their success was the reason that the powers that be, if you will, could not permit them to go on. So why was there a problem? Why would you want to take down a charity organization that is successful? Why would you want to stop an operation that was doing so much good? And if you look on the screen, there's some examples of the work that they did. They took care of orphans, they took care of refugees, they took care of people who were victims of disasters, both man-made and natural disasters. They were helping people all over the United States after 9/11, after the Oklahoma City bombing. around the world, in Chechnya, in Albania, in all kinds of places, Kosovo. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There are quotes, I have one quote there, but there are endless quotes from people in the West Bank, in Palestine, who are saying how their work alleviated the suffering of thousands and thousands in Palestine, of the poorest of the poor. And yet they had to be taken down. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is why? Why would anybody want to stop such a positive operation? Why would anybody want to stop an organization that was able to bring together so many different groups, so many different other organizations, and do so much good? So this story has several levels to it. And the challenge that I had in writing the book has, is how do you bring all these three levels, all these three sub-narratives, if you will, and create a single story. There's the personal story of the actual men, their families, and the community. There is the story of the judicial process. And there is the story of the U.S.-Israel relations. And all of these three have to come together because all of these three have, the story has to do with all of these three at different levels. So why they had to be brought down has everything to do with this very strange and very sick relationship, if you will, between the U.S. and Israel. As you heard, and as I'm sure many of you know, Israel has its own agents here in the United States to make sure that the narrative that is taught, the narrative that is displayed, the narrative that is respected, the narrative that's accepted, the narrative that is talked about as the right narrative in regards to what is happening in Palestine is the Zionist Israeli narrative. And that narrative always places Israel as good and positive and Palestinians as bad and terrorists, to simplify it. So anything that's Palestinian has to be categorized as negative and has to be somehow conflated with terrorism. Some of you may recall a few years ago there was an exhibit of children's art from Gaza. You couldn't find a place to display it. Any place that wanted to display this, artwork by children was attacked because this was anti-Semitic and this was terrorism. Try to produce a play by a Palestinian playwright. Ghassan Kanafani, you name it, any. You won't be able to find a place. Nobody will show a play by Palestinians because it's terrorism, it's supposed terrorism, it promotes terrorism, and it's anti-Semitic. Try to talk about Palestinian rights, Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian political life, the Palestinian resistance. It's all terrorism. BDS, it's of course terrorism and it's anti-Semitism all combined. Nothing that's Palestinian can possibly be displayed in a positive light. And there was one area that was left alone. There was one area that wasn't touched, and that was the area of relief and charity. And the Holy Land Foundation was really doing fabulous work. And this was a problem because they were doing such good work. They were displaying and they were showing the Palestinians in a positive light in terms of their ability. They're also showing a picture of Palestine, of the suffering of refugees, the suffering of political prisoners, the families of prisoners, the orphans that were created as a result of the brutality of the Israeli rule and so forth. And nobody was taking care of any of these people. Nobody's taking care of these problems. And of course the question is, why isn't the ruling party, which is Israel, or the ruling power, taking care of all these problems? So all of these things were coming up, not because these guys wanted it, but because it was inevitable. They were trying to stay apolitical. Their motto was need not creed, and so on and so forth. So, in the early to mid 1990s, the Antidefamation League, which is an organization that pretends to be a civil rights organization, but is really a fascist, terrorist supporting organization that should be outlawed, is decided that they were going to take on this case. And they began spreading rumors that the money raised by the Holy Land Foundation was going to support terrorism. And they went to the IRS and started demanding that their not-for-profit status be taken away. and they began publishing articles. And they began talking to the FBI. And they were able to bring along people like Chuck Schumer and Anthony Weiner and other major political Zionist groups, individuals here in the United States to support this. And they succeeded. It was a slow process, but it was a successful process. They began, their reputation was being tainted already. Then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, the sense in this country, some of us are old enough to remember, the sense in this country was panic. Something had to be done. Somebody had to be arrested. Monies had to be closed down. Assets had to be frozen. And this is something that's been published and written about quite a lot. That after 9/11 in Washington, D.C., there was a sense of we got to round up the usual suspects and we got to do something. Well, Holy Land Foundation was at the top of the usual suspect list. So they were closed down by executive order by George Bush without due process. Their assets were frozen and they were designated and declared a terrorist organization. The problem with that was that there was absolutely no proof that any of this was true. There was no proof to show that they were a terrorist organization. There was no proof to show that they were funding terrorism. And particularly, they were saying that they're supporting Hamas, that their money was going to support Hamas. There was no proof whatsoever showing that they were supporting Hamas. But the president said so. He said so in front of the cameras. So now everybody's had to work really, really hard to make sure that we can prove it. One of the most interesting things that I found about this story is that after this happened, the president declared them a terrorist funding organization, seized their assets, closed them down, and they were not concerned because they knew that this was America and there's a justice system in America, and as immigrants, they knew that if you work hard and you do everything right, you're going to be okay. They knew this. They believed this firmly. And so they use the tools that are given to citizens when the government acts arbitrarily. They sued the government, and they had a perfect case, and they had all the evidence to show they did nothing wrong. In fact, they did everything right, and they went above and beyond to make sure that they did everything right. And they brought a substantial body of evidence to show that they did everything right. They always paid their taxes on time, every penny was accounted for, and so forth. And the government brought in what's called the administrative record, which was a flimsy file with flimsy evidence. Some photocopies of newspaper articles, a few documents that were faxed over by the government of Israel, which played a big role in this case. Some statements that claimed that these guys were members of Hamas and so forth. Basically nonsense. And off they went to court. The judge in Washington, D.C. dismissed the case and struck the evidence from the record. Which is beyond unusual. Now, besides the fact that this was unheard of, there was absolutely no reason to explain, no way to explain why she would do this. There was a serious problem with this because the government had a statement, the government's file had a statement in which they claimed one of the employees of Holy Land Foundation in Jerusalem, in an interrogation by the police, by the Israeli police, said that Holy Land actually gave money to Hamas. So this was obviously a problem. So their lawyers contacted his lawyer in Jerusalem, which is she's a very well-known civil rights attorney, Lat Semel, and she said, "What are you talking about? I have all of his statements. He says no such thing." And she sent over his statements. They had these statements translated by a translation firm, notarized, under oath, and he said the exact opposite. The correct translation was in the evidence that was struck from the record. The wrong translation was in the government's record, which remained. So they went to appeal. And the appellate court said, and this is when the lawyers began to understand something was definitely going wrong. The appellate court said the judge should not have struck the evidence from the record. However, and this word keeps coming up quite a lot, however, this is not a normal case. This is a case of national security, and therefore they upheld the lower court's decision. So now the lawyers are beginning to understand that their guys, it doesn't matter what they did, these guys are not going to get a fair trial. And then they heard that they're planning, the government is preparing a criminal case against them. And they thought, well, there's no crime. How could they have a criminal case when there's no crime? And then what the government did is they learned from their mistakes, and they learned from everything that they saw happening in the civil court, in the civil lawsuit, and they amended the charges. They changed the story a little bit. They said, well, they didn't actually give money to Hamas. They give money to organizations that seem legitimate, but are actually, they seem legitimate charity organizations, but are actually controlled by Hamas. And the way they were going to prove that is through massive amounts of documents that were seized by the Israeli army and faxed over and translated here, and by bringing in witnesses who were members of the Israeli secret police and the Israeli military intelligence to testify anonymously as expert witnesses, something that had never happened and never been allowed in a courtroom in America until then, which is really an enormous stretch. But still, you have to wonder, and this is a question that I asked myself quite a lot, how do you combine, how do you conflate charity and relief with terrorism? I mean, somebody had to sit in a room one day and say, we need to put these things together, and here's how we're going to do it. Because it's not obvious. It's not obvious that supporting refugees and orphans and poor people is somehow connected to terrorism. So how do you do this? So what the government said is this. Holy Land Foundation had a program to support orphans in Palestine. So they said these orphans are orphans because their fathers were terrorists and they died as suicide bombers and so forth. And again, this is something that was said in a courtroom by experts, by terrorism experts, PhDs who sit in think tanks in Washington, D.C. That by supporting these orphans, they're not only supporting terrorism, they're encouraging terrorism. Why? Because if a parent knows, if a father knows that his children are going to be taken care of, then of course he will volunteer to become a terrorist and blow himself up. I mean, for $50 a month, wouldn't all of us do the same thing? I mean, we'd sign up immediately. If we knew that our kids were going to get $50 a month stipend from the government or from some charity. This was a serious argument that was being presented as evidence by witnesses in a court of law. So what the lawyers did is they took a look at the actual orphans that Holy Land supported and the cause of death of the parent. And none of them died as a result of what might be considered terrorism. Then I went the other way and I took a look at the cases of Palestinians who participated in suicide missions when these were taking place, which was a long time ago. And none of them had, some 200 or so cases, and none of them had children. So whichever way you look at the case, these orphans did not become orphans as a result of anything that might be considered terrorism. But none of that mattered. The story was a good story, and they weren't going to let a good story be ruined by the facts. So that was one example. Another example is that they're supporting the families of prisoners, political prisoners. Israel has been holding thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners for decades. In fact, they say that Palestinians are the most incarcerated people in the world. And not for crime, but for, supposedly terrorism, security reasons. And the same argument was made there. Why are these people in prison? Because they're terrorists. So if we support their families, then we're supporting, or in fact encouraging, terrorism. And this is an argument that's taking place now. Israel just closed down the Palestinian National Fund, which supports the families of prisoners. And all these issues about money going to the Palestinian Authority became an issue because of that. And in Europe, they're closing down Palestinian charities that are sending money to support the families of prisoners. And the prisoner issue is a huge, enormous issue in Palestine. You're not going to find a family in Palestine that doesn't either have or had, in the past, a family member who was a prisoner. Again, this was the argument. If you support the families, you're encouraging terrorism. Never mind the fact that according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of Palestinians in Israeli jails have never been engaged in acts of violence. They've never even been charged with acts of violence. These are all political prisoners. But again, nobody wants to destroy a good story with the facts. And so this was brought in as evidence. Now, the expert witnesses were questioned by the defense team thoroughly. And it was absolutely clear that they knew very little about the actual organizations with which Hoyland is working in Palestine. These are called zakat committees, local charity committees. And they were saying that they're controlled somehow by Hamas. So they were asked, have you visited their offices? No. Do you know their board members? No. The defense went one board member at a time. Each committee that is mentioned in the indictment. And these expert witnesses that were brought as witnesses from all the way from Israel knew nothing about any of them and could offer no information about any of them. But that didn't matter, they said, because they're such experts that they can smell Hamas. And again, this was said in a court of law and taken seriously in a court of law. They can smell Hamas. They don't need the evidence. They don't need to know the people. They know what they know. Now, let me show you what happened as a result of this, okay? So the first trial ended, it was a mistrial, hung jury. The government came back about a year later, second trial, and the second judge allowed, and as ridiculous as the first trial was, and outrageous in terms of the evidence and the witnesses that the first judge allowed, the second judge allowed evidence that even the first judge did not allow, and witnesses that the first judge did not allow, and the second trial ended with all convictions. They went to appeal. And they showed how the judge in the second trial permitted evidence and witnesses that should not have been permitted and were not permitted in the first trial. The appellate court said, true, the second judge should not have allowed these pieces of evidence. However, once again, however, this is not a regular case. This is special, national security. And they said it was harmless. So the defense team said, what do you mean it was harmless? The first trial ended up with a hung jury, no convictions. The second trial ended with all convictions, and this was the difference. But that's it. The appellate court didn't want to discuss it anymore. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. President Obama was petitioned, but wouldn't pick up the phone and wasn't interested in, of course, commuting their sentences. Even though there was a campaign, he was able to deport them. And there were several governments that were willing to accept them and give them citizenship. Who wouldn't? These are some of the finest men you'll ever meet. But Obama wouldn't do it. So let me show you just who these men are. So this is Abdurrahman Ode. He had nothing to do with the operational side of this organization. He was a volunteer. He would go on missions, as people often do with charity organizations. And from the very beginning, the FBI was trying to get him to come and work with them. Come and work with us, come and work with us, you know the community, come and work with us. And he said, no, thank you. They kept coming to him at 5 o'clock in the morning, knocking on his door, stopping him on his way to work, coming to his office, on and on and on. And he kept saying, no, thank you, I'm not interested. They brought in federal agents who were Palestinians, who spoke Arabic, to try to convince him. He said, no, thank you, I'm not interested. Finally, they said to him, you're going to regret this. You're going to pay for this. So then, he was indicted with the others. During the trial, they approached him and offered him a plea deal where he could be out in 3 years. We're talking about terrorism charges, so that's a good deal. But the plea deal came with a gag order, which meant he was pleading that he actually did something wrong. The government was going to use that against the others, and he would be bound by a gag order. He said, no, thank you. They came back to him again, and they offered him 6 months. And the other guy said to him, take the deal. You'd be out in 6 months, at least one of us would be out. He said, I'm not taking the deal with a gag order. He's serving 15 years in federal prison now. And I'm sitting with him in federal prison, in the visitation room, an innocent man. And he says to me, I'm a free man. Alhamdulillah, I said, I sleep well at night. 15 years in federal prison, he could have been out in 6 months. He wouldn't betray his brothers. You don't find people like that every day. The next one is Muhammad al-Mazain. He's kind of the inspiration, the spiritual inspiration behind the whole thing. He's a well-learned man, knows the Quran by heart. He was an imam in several different places around the United States. And he's the oldest one of the 5. Also had very little to do with the actual operational organization, of the operational side of the organization. And I visited him in federal prison. You know, he's not well, but he's a strong man, very strong physically, very impressive. And one of the times I met with him was right after Donald Trump was elected. And there was this bill proposed, I think by Ted Cruz, to add the Muslim Brotherhood to the designated terrorist organizations. And think what you might about the Muslim Brotherhood, they are a highly respected organization in the Arab world. And so we're sitting there and we're talking about this, and he looks at me and he says, I am a Muslim brother. They will never change who I am. Now we're sitting in a visitation room in federal prison. He can't go up to go to the bathroom without permission. And he's a freer man than any man I've ever seen. He's sitting and says to me, I am a Muslim brother, and they were never going to change me. And this is who I am. Completely unafraid, completely free, even though, again, he's sitting for 15 years, an innocent man, in federal prison. Third one is Mufid Abdul Qadir. He got 20 years. Now, after the first trial, he was found not guilty on all charges. He was the only one that was found not guilty on all charges. 32 charges, the judge called out not guilty 32 times. And he had nothing to do with the operational side of the organization. He was completely a volunteer. He would volunteer to sing and do skits and raise money and stuff like that, which a lot of people do with charity organizations. But he has a brother, and his brother's name is Khalid Mash'al. And Khalid Mash'al was the political head of Hamas for many, many years. And at the beginning of the trial, in their opening statement, the prosecution said, family connections are not a reason to convict. And then they brought expert witnesses, FBI agents, who said that in terrorist organizations, family connections are very important. So in other words, they said one thing and then brought witnesses to say the exact opposite. He hadn't seen his brother in 30 years, but still, they needed him to seal the deal. So he was found not guilty on all charges, but when the prosecution was polling the jury, one of the jurors stood up and she said, no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to say not guilty on all charges. That's not what I meant. So regardless of the fact that the foreman said that they all signed and agreed, that the defense team stood up and said this was absurd, the judge called a mistrial on him as well. And he ended up getting 20 years in the second trial. And then the third one, Shukri Abu Bakr, was the absolute engine, mind, spirit, and everything of the Holy Land Foundation. And the prosecution said, when they're trying to connect Holy Land and Hamas, they're saying, well, Hamas was established in 1987, Holy Land Foundation was established in 1987, there we are. Obvious connection. What they left out were two other things. The first Palestinian Intifada began in 1987, which created an enormous need for relief because there were curfews, because People could not work, people could not buy food, there was no access to money, there was no access to basic most needs, and a lot of prisoners and a lot of casualties. The other thing that happened in 1987 is Shukri's daughter, Sanaba, was born, and she was born with several life-threatening diseases. And she needed a lot of care, and so this was the first time, this is how Shukri became aware of this ability to, charity hospitals and relief and so forth. And that inspired him to get into this kind of work. In the book, I dedicate to Sanabil because of that and other reasons that you'll have to read. But she was a big part of his life, of his work, of his inspiration. And then the final one, he's the only one that I was not able to meet, is Ghassan Ilashi. Some of you maybe know Noor, his daughter. And he was also, he and Shukri together really ran the organization, ran the operation, and he received 65 years in prison. So these are probably the finest men you will ever meet. To say that these are just fine, innocent men is an understatement. These are the finest men anybody will ever meet. And their intention was to do good. Their intention was to help their people. Their intention was to help all people, as many people as they could. And they did a tremendous job. And it is tragic beyond words that these 5 men are in federal prison today. And one of the things that, again, like I said earlier, that I did was to go visit them. I was able to visit all but Ghassan. And the process to visit a loved one, to visit somebody in prison, is so humiliating. It is so difficult. It is so frustrating. And they're not my family. I mean, I love these men. I respect them greatly. But they're not my family. They're not my fathers. They're not my... And you can only imagine what it must be like, the frustration, the horror that it is to go visit somebody you love in prison and to know that they're innocent, that they shouldn't even be there to begin with. Never mind the expense of the fact that you have to fly all over the country, you have to book a hotel. Sometimes you get there and there's the prison is shut down because something happened. So you make all this enormous effort and you can't even go visit them. It's beyond frustrating. And the toughest thing of it all, I think, is to leave. Because at the end of the visit, you leave them there. You leave them there. And it's heart-wrenching. The trip back home is just absolutely heart-wrenching. So this is a very sad story, there's no question about it. I think the key, if we want to make a change, the key is, number one, to know the story well, which is why I wrote the book, and to get as much information as possible about who they are, what was the nature of their work, what were they accused of, who is Hamas, who are the Muslim Brothers, why this is a problem, and understand this whole connection between Israel and the United States. Because that's the key. And then to act as much as we can to end this relationship and to end this reality that exists where the US and Israel are collaborating in what is happening in Palestine. Because none of this would be an issue. None of these guys would be in jail had it not been for what is happening in Palestine. None of these would be in jail if they were not Palestinian Muslims. This would not be a case, this would not be a story. It's only because they're Palestinians, only because they're Muslims, they are in prison, and only because of what is happening in Palestine. So we have to understand the larger picture, we have to understand what is happening in Palestine, we have to fight to free Palestine, we have to embrace the call to impose boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel in order to bring about that change. And that is how we can bring about change to things like this story and Lena's father's story and others. That is the connection that we all have to, we need to educate ourselves and then we need to act. And we need to understand also that things are getting worse. Things are absolutely getting worse. In Palestine, if anybody who has ears and eyes knows that the reality in Palestine right now is horrifying. And the reality here in the United States for Palestinians and Muslims, like Lena was saying, the community is not that big and so many have already been implicated. So we have to get involved, we have to get educated, and then we have to spread the word and make sure people understand the connection and why this connection is important, and then what we do to make a change. And we have to remember, we're all voting for our elected representatives vote each year to give Israel money. They vote each year to continue and allow what is happening in Palestine. We vote for them. We need to make sure that they know whether we agree or not. And if we don't agree, we need to make sure that they know that and that they won't be getting another term. So this is it's complex, but it's not that complex. So I encourage all of you to get involved, to get informed, and then to act. Thank you all very much.